Hey guys, it's Amber from Notable Ink, and today I'm sharing 3D layering die hacks. I'm thrilled to introduce Altenew's brand new Craft-A-Flower subscription plan. The Craft-A-Flower die set releases on the 7th day of each month and includes all the pieces you need to create a multi-layered floral arrangement. While colored cardstock is a perfect choice, I'm going to watercolor my pieces today to add more dimension. Here I have the Altenew Watercolor Paper Pad. This is a 100% cotton 9x12 cold press paper pad, and I've cut one sheet in half. I also have the watercolor brush markers, the Winter Wonderland, Tropical Fiesta, and Spring Garden sets. I used a couple colors from each set, but if you have only one set, of course you can mix and match your colors. Here's the Craft-A-Flower Lily set, and this is the first in the subscription plan. And of course you have the layering guide on the front of the packaging as well as a picture of each one of the dies. So let's get started. In the past, when I've watercolored for die cuts, I've gone ahead and watercolored a panel with light and dark colors and then die cut the panel. I thought it would be easier, this is going to be my first hack, to actually just die cut the pieces first from the watercolor cardstock and then watercolor directly on those pieces. So you can see I have one of every single one of the dies here. They're die cut all the way through. And here's the photo inspiration that I'm going to use. So I'm not going for this realism. I'm actually just using that as a color reference. So if you're struggling with choosing your color palette, I highly recommend just pull up a picture of the flower that you're trying to color. It's going to give you so many different color options and it makes it so much easier. So I have Midnight Violet, Purple Wine, Rouge, and Citrus Burst here. And I've just added them to a ceramic palette over here and dropped a dropper full of water in there. I covered the bottom most solid layer in clean clear water, and now I'm dropping on some of the watered down Rouge ink and then also adding some Citrus Burst to the center of that. So I'm not going for a smooth look, I'm going for more of a blotchy and watercolor look. I don't want any smooth things because if I wanted smooth, then I might as well just use cardstock. So we're trying to add dimension here. So I put down a layer of the Midnight Violet, really watered down, and then I added some full pigment to some of the areas, but not all. Now this looks like a hot mess right now, but it's not going to look like that when we're done. So you just kind of have to trust the process and go with it. What I'm thinking about as I'm coloring these is I'm looking at the die packaging and looking at the layering guide to see, you know, normally your largest layer is going to be the lightest color and then each layer gets darker. So I'm thinking about that as I'm adding colors and making sure that I have dark pigments in the right areas. And you'll see that as we go further through the video. For the stamens, I'm going to use that same Rouge color. The third layer that I had up top was the Purple Wine. And then now I know that I need to darken some of these up. There's not enough contrast in these. And I do find this already to be much easier doing it this way rather than creating a watercolor panel and then trying to die cut out in areas where it's going to be darker versus lighter. That was a little harder to manage. You still get a pretty look that way, and I'll link to another project up above where I did that. So now I have limeade and moss, so same thing, I'm going to water those down a little bit. The first coat I'm going to put down on the leaves and the stems is the limeade, and then I'll come in and create some shadows with the moss. So that larger leaf, that first one that I did, is going to be the bottom layer. So I want that to still stay lighter, and here I was like, ooh, that's too dark because it's supposed to be the bottom layer. So I'm trying to lighten that up with some water. I'm going to blot it up with my paper towel, but ultimately I'm going to have to go much darker on the second layer of these leaves so that there's enough contrast between the two layers. So here I'm just going to add some shadows to the stems. And then I realized I forgot that little piece up there. That's pretty much the center of the flower, so that's going to need to be very dark. And so I'm adding pigment directly from the watercolor brush. And you can see that I'm darkening up some areas here. And it doesn't need to be perfect. It can be splotchy. It doesn't have to be completely blended. I think that adds to the watercolor look of it. So unlike your Copic markers, it doesn't need to be smooth and blended at all. So here they're still damp and I have them on a paper towel drying off, but I'm adding them and kind of stacking them together to see if I need to darken up any areas. There wasn't enough contrast between that third layer and the second layer, so I'm going to darken up some of those areas to make sure I have enough contrast. And there I can see that looks much better. I'm going to do that with the leaves as well. So this is the second layer of the leaves. And I'm going to take the watercolor brush directly to the die cut and darken those up. And you can see that the die cut is still damp because you see that pigment kind of feathering out and blending out into the cardstock or watercolor paper. I really wanted the tips of these stamens to have quite a bit of contrast, so I'm going just straight in with the black, jet black watercolor brush marker, and I hadn't used that yet, so I needed to get the ink started on it. So I'm just going to color those black. Here I'm just taking a little bit of fuller strength rouge and dotting that on for a little more texture on those stamens. They were a little too smooth. Another hack that I showed earlier but didn't talk about is when I die cut the pieces, I kept them in the original watercolor panel so that they stayed secure and weren't moving all over the place as I was trying to paint them. I didn't want to chase them around my mat. Another hack for your 3D layering dies is to add foam tape in between some of the layers. So I like to use the Derice foam squares or the Derice foam strips. They're very narrow and easy to work with on these small die cuts. So I'm adding some foam tape behind the second layer and then also behind the fourth layer. Those are the only two layers of the flowers that I'll add foam tape. You don't need it under all of the layers, but you'll see once you add the second layer that it casts these shadows onto the lightest layer underneath. And I think that just adds so much more visual dimension without you having to color. I'm going to compare these for you here. So here I just have two that are not glued together. They're not popped up. The die cut is a little bit warped from the drying process, but you can see the difference in the shadows that are casted when it's popped up. So for the third layer, I'm going to glue that directly to the second layer. It's not popped up. And again, you want to pick and choose what makes sense. So that second layer has quite a bit more space where you can hide the foam tape underneath it. This small dainty piece really doesn't have anywhere to hide that foam tape. So that's going to get glued directly to the surface of the second layer. These are really easy to line up. Altenew does a great job of giving you several different areas that match the die cut before it exactly. So it's really easy to line up. For this fourth layer, I've added one foam square underneath it. And the last layer is the stamen, which will be glued directly to that fourth layer. Here's the finished flower. For the background, I'm using block print, which is such a fabulous stamp set, and I forget that I have it in my stash. I would love to see a second version of this because I think it's so perfect for a backdrop. So I have the Obsidian Pigment Ink here, and I'm just stamping a sentiment. This is from Sentiment Strips. It's either Sentiment Strips or Sentiment Strips 2. I'll have the correct one listed down below. I'm just going to pop up one side of this flower because the left side sits on the other flower. And then I'm also going to pop up the stem that goes to this flower as well. The leaves, because the top layer is popped up, they kind of fit into the stem like a little puzzle piece. And then after I get everything adhered down, I'm going to add some splatter. As always, I add the splatter with jet black ink spray. Just tap off the nozzle into the bottle to get the majority of the ink off, and then you can tap it directly on your project. I like the splatter right there, but then I come in and do it one more time, which I think is a little too much, but there we are. I can't take it back. Here's a close-up of the 3D die cuts, and I hope that you guys enjoyed this project today. All of the details for the Craft-A-Flower subscription plan will be on my blog. Be sure to check that out and leave a comment while you're there so that you're in for a chance to win a prize. If you like this video and you haven't done so already, be sure to like, subscribe, and ring that bell down below. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I'll see you real soon with more inspiration.